Welcome back to Park Ranger Files, where the mountains hold secrets darker than the hollows themselves. Tonight, I'm sharing 8 true stories from the hills and backwoods of West Virginia. But before we begin, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Your support helps this channel reach others. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. And if you've ever experienced anything strange in West Virginia. Let's begin. Story 1. I took a job at a small accounting firm in Helvetia right out of college. Mostly because the pay was decent, and I had student loans breathing down my neck. The town itself was tiny, one of those places where everyone knows everyone, and newcomers stick out like a sore thumb. My boss, Gerald, set me up in a rental house on the edge of town, said it belonged to his brother-in-law who had moved to Charleston for work. The rent was almost nothing, which should have been my first clue. The house sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by dense woods on 3 sides. It was a simple 2-bedroom place, probably built in the 50s, with that particular smell old houses get when they've been closed up too long. Mildew and wood smoke and something else, something I couldn't quite place. Still, I was grateful. Living in town would have cost 3 times as much. First week went fine. Quiet. Predictable. I'd drive to work, come home, heat up dinner, watch whatever came through the antenna. The isolation didn't bother me much. I'd grown up in rural Pennsylvania, so the sound of wind through trees and the occasional animal rustling outside felt normal enough. Then small things started happening. Nothing dramatic. Just off. I'd leave my coffee mug on the kitchen counter in the morning, come home to find it in the sink. My shoes would migrate from the front door to the bedroom. Keys that I swore I'd left on the hook would turn up on the bathroom counter. At first, I blamed myself. Thought maybe I was more tired than I realized, moving on autopilot. But then I found the handprint. It was on the inside of my bedroom window, pressed against the glass like someone had been looking out. The problem was, it was on the inside, and the fingers were too long, stretched in a way that didn't look right. Each fingertip had left a smudge, and when I measured my own hand against it, mine came up short by nearly 2 inches. I mentioned it to Gerald the next day, casual, like I was making conversation. He went quiet for a moment, then asked if I'd heard anything at night. I said no. He nodded slowly, then told me if I ever did, to stay in my room and keep the lights off. Just like that, no explanation. Then he walked back to his office and shut the door. That same night, I heard it for the first time. It started around 2 a.m., a soft tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate. Tap, 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 like someone drumming their fingers on wood. I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was a branch hitting the side of the house. But the tapping moved. It traveled along the exterior wall, slow and methodical, from the living room toward my bedroom window. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself, heavy and expectant, like something was waiting just outside. I didn't move, barely breathed, until finally exhaustion pulled me under. The next morning, there were scratches on the window frame. Thin, parallel lines, 4 of them, like something had dragged its fingers across the wood. Fresh splinters curled away from the gouges. I started leaving lights on at night. Didn't help. The tapping continued, always around 2 a.m., always moving along the walls. Sometimes it would stop at the front door, and I'd hear the doorknob rattle, slow and testing, like someone checking to see if it was locked. One night, I made the mistake of looking. I'd been lying awake, listening to the tapping make its usual circuit, when curiosity got the better of me. I crept to the living room window, pulled the curtain back just an inch, and peered out into the darkness. There was a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 30 feet from the house. Tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that hung too long at its sides. It wasn't moving, just standing there, facing the house. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark silhouette against the slightly lighter background of the woods. Then it tilted its head, slow, like it was listening. I dropped the curtain and backed away from the window, heart hammering so hard I thought my ribs might crack. The tapping stopped immediately. No sound at all. just that oppressive silence again. When I finally worked up the courage to look again, it was gone. The next day, I found footprints in the mud near my porch, but they were wrong. Too narrow, too long, with a strange spacing between them, like whatever made them didn't walk the way humans do. I told Gerald I was leaving, made up some excuse about a family emergency. He didn't try to talk me out of it, just nodded and asked when I'd be back. I said I didn't know. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Probably for the best." Before I left town, I stopped at the local diner for coffee. The waitress, an older woman named Dolores, asked where I was staying. When I told her, her face went pale. She leaned in close and whispered, "That house has been empty for 3 years. Gerald's brother-in-law didn't move to Charleston. He disappeared one night, just left his car in the driveway with the keys still in it. They never found him." She straightened up, poured my coffee, and walked away without another word. I drove straight through to Pennsylvania. Didn't stop except for gas. Haven't been back to West Virginia since. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that tapping in my dreams. Tap, 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 moving along the walls, it's getting closer. Story 2. I moved to Sutton after my divorce. Needed a fresh start somewhere nobody knew my name or my story. Got a job doing ITAI work for the county. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills and kept me busy. The town was small, friendly enough, with that particular Appalachian charm that makes you feel like you've stepped back in time 20 years. My apartment was on the second floor of an old building downtown, right above a hardware store that had been there since the 40s. Rent was cheap. The landlord was never around, and I could walk to work. Perfect setup for someone trying to rebuild their life piece by piece. About 2 months in, I started dating someone I'd met at the county office, a records clerk named Bethany. She'd grown up in Sutton, knew every back road and local legend, and had this easy laugh that made everything feel lighter. We'd spend evenings driving around, her showing me places tourists never saw. Old churches, abandoned homesteads, swimming holes hidden deep in the woods. One night, she took me to a bridge outside town, a narrow steel structure that crossed a dried-up creek bed. The locals called it the Singing Bridge, she said, because of the sound the wind made, passing through the metal framework. It was a popular spot for high school kids, somewhere to park and drink and pretend they were getting away with something. We sat on the hood of my car, sharing a six-pack, watching the stars come out. The bridge did make noise, a low humming that rose and fell with the breeze, almost musical. Almost. Bethany told me the legend, casual, like she was recounting a movie plot. Back in the 30s, a woman named Sarah Blackwood had thrown herself off the bridge after her husband left her for someone younger. They found her body 3 days later, caught in the rocks downstream. Ever since, people claim to hear singing late at night, a woman's voice, slow and mournful, coming from the bridge itself. I laughed it off, said it was probably just the wind. Bethany shrugged, smiled, said maybe, but she didn't sound convinced. We left around midnight, drove back to town, and I didn't think about the bridge again until a week later. I'd been working late, finishing up some server maintenance, and decided to take the scenic route home. The road curved through the hills, past farms and dark stretches of forest, eventually crossing the Singing Bridge. As I drove onto it, my headlights caught something in the middle of the span. A woman. She stood perfectly still, facing away from me, wearing a long white dress that looked almost luminous in the dark. Her hair hung down her back, straight and dark, swaying slightly even though there was no wind. I slammed on the brakes, heart jumping into my throat. The car stopped maybe 20 feet from her. She didn't move, didn't turn around, just stood there. I rolled down my window, called out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Nothing. I honked the horn, short and sharp. Still nothing. Then, slowly, she began to turn. I don't know why, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave. I threw the car in reverse, hit the gas, and backed off the bridge faster than I should have. As soon as I cleared the span, I looked back. She was gone. The bridge was empty, just dark metal and shadows. I sat there, engine idling, hands shaking on the wheel, trying to process what I'd just seen. Eventually, I drove around the long way, took the main highway back to town. I told Bethany the next day, half expecting her to laugh. She didn't. Instead, she got this look, somewhere between concern and resignation, and asked if I'd seen her face. I said no, that I'd left before she turned all the way around. Bethany nodded slowly, then told me something that made my blood run cold. People who saw Sarah's face, she said, didn't last long. Accidents, sudden illnesses, unexplained disappearances. Nothing you could prove. But the pattern was there if you looked. I tried to brush it off. Told myself it was just small-town superstition, that what I'd seen was probably just someone messing around. But deep down, I knew better. The way that woman stood, the complete stillness, the dress that seemed to glow in the dark, it wasn't right. 2 nights later, I woke up to singing. It was faint at first, drifting through my open window. A woman's voice carrying a melody I didn't recognize. Slow, mournful, achingly beautiful. I got out of bed, walked to the window, and looked down at the empty street below. The singing continued, closer now, like it was coming from just outside my building. I leaned out, scanning the sidewalk, the parked cars, the darkened storefronts. Nothing. Then I looked up. She was standing on the roof of the building across the street, silhouetted against the night sky, still wearing that white dress. Even from that distance, I could see her hair moving, swaying like it was underwater. She was looking right at me. I stumbled back from the window, heart racing, and slammed it shut. Drew the curtains, turned on every light in the apartment. The singing stopped immediately, but I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I called in sick to work, packed a bag, and drove to my brother's place in Ohio. Told him I needed a few days to clear my head. He didn't ask questions. When I came back a week later, Bethany was gone. Her apartment was empty, cleared out like she'd never lived there. The county office said she'd resigned, no forwarding address, no explanation. I asked around town, but nobody seemed to know where she went. Or if they did, they weren't saying. One of the older guys at work, a maintenance supervisor named Dale, pulled me aside one day and told me to let it go. Said some things in these mountains had roots deeper than anyone understood, and digging into them only brought trouble. I took his advice. Left Sutton 6 months later, got a job in Morgantown, started over again. Haven't crossed a bridge after dark since. Don't plan to. If you're enjoying these stories, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment. Tell me if you've ever experienced anything strange in West Virginia, or share your own encounters. Your engagement helps this channel grow and reach more people who need to hear these warnings. The algorithm pushes content that gets interaction. So every comment, every like, every share makes a real difference. Thank you. Story 3. I worked pipeline inspection for a contractor based out of Charleston, driving to different sites across the state, checking pressure readings, looking for leaks, filing reports. It was solitary work, which suited me fine. I'd always preferred my own company, and the job paid well enough to cover child support and leave me with enough left over to live on. Most sites were easy to access, right off main roads or near developed areas. But some, especially the older lines running through remote sections, required hiking in with equipment. Those were the jobs I actually liked. Getting out into the woods, away from traffic and noise and people. In late October, I got assigned to check a section of pipeline running through the Monongahela National Forest, deep in the backcountry south of Elkins. The access point was a dirt road that barely qualified as such. More like 2 ruts through the trees that looked like they hadn't been used in years. I parked my truck at the trailhead, loaded up my pack with tools and monitoring equipment, and started hiking. The trail climbed steadily through dense hardwood forest, past moss-covered rocks and fallen logs slowly being reclaimed by the earth. It was quiet, almost too quiet. with none of the usual bird calls or rustling you'd expect. Just the sound of my boots on the trail and my own breathing. About a mile in, I came across something strange. There were figures, dozens of them, scattered through the woods on both sides of the trail. At first, I thought they were scarecrows, some kind of Halloween display maybe. But as I got closer, I realized they were made from natural materials. Branches and bark and dried vines twisted together into roughly human shapes. They weren't crude either. Each one had been carefully constructed, with detailed hands and faces. Some even had clothes, old rotted fabric that hung from their wooden frames. They stood at various heights, some barely 3 feet tall, others well over 6, positioned among the trees like they were watching the trail. I stopped, unsure what to make of it. Checked my map to make sure I was in the right place. I was. The pipeline markers should be just ahead. I kept walking, trying to ignore the figures, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every few steps, I'd glance to the side, half expecting one of them to have moved. They hadn't, of course, but the sensation persisted, crawling up my spine like cold fingers. The pipeline markers appeared right where they should be, a series of yellow posts with reflective tape marking the line's path. I set up my equipment, started running diagnostics, trying to focus on the work and not the wooden figures surrounding me. That's when I heard the humming. It was low, barely audible at first, like the sound of distant machinery. But there was no machinery out here. No roads, no buildings, nothing for miles. The humming grew louder, more distinct, and I realized it was voices, multiple voices, all humming the same note in unison. I looked around but saw no one, just trees and shadows and those damn figures. The humming stopped abruptly. Then, one by one, the figures began to sway. Not from wind. There was no wind. They moved deliberately, rhythmically, like they were dancing to music only they could hear. Their stick arms lifted, lowered, their wooden heads tilted, turned. I grabbed my equipment, didn't bother packing it properly, just shoved it in my bag and started backing away. The figures continued their slow dance. Oblivious to my presence, that's when I saw him. A man. A real man, standing among the figures about 50 yards off the trail. He was watching me, completely still while everything around him moved. He wore old-fashioned clothes, like something from 100 years ago, and his face was pale, too pale, almost gray. I called out, "Hey, you okay?" He didn't respond, didn't move, just stared with eyes that didn't seem to blink. Then he smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not a human smile. But something stretched and wrong. Like his face didn't quite know how smiling worked. And then, slowly, he began walking toward me. Not walking exactly. His legs moved, but he glided across the forest floor like he wasn't quite touching the ground. The stick figures parted for him, creating a path, their swaying intensifying. I didn't wait to see what he wanted. I ran, crashed through the underbrush, back toward the trail, branches whipping at my face and arms. Behind me, I could hear footsteps, multiple footsteps, heavy and deliberate, getting closer. I risked a glance back. There were more of them now, 5 or 6, all dressed in those old clothes, all with that same gray skin, all moving with that strange gliding walk. And between them, the stick figures lurched forward, no longer dancing, but walking, their wooden joints creaking and snapping. I hit the main trail and pushed harder, lungs burning, legs screaming, but I didn't slow down. Couldn't slow down. The footsteps behind me kept pace, never falling back, never catching up, just maintaining that constant distance. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my pack in the bed, jumped in the cab, and locked the doors. Hands shaking, I fumbled with the keys, dropped them, retrieved them from the floor, finally got the engine started. As I threw the truck into reverse, I looked back at the trailhead. They were standing there, all of them. The gray men and the stick figures, lined up along the edge of the woods, watching, waiting. I didn't stop driving until I hit pavement. Back at the office, I filed my report. Said the site was inaccessible due to hazardous conditions. My supervisor asked what kind of hazards. I said unstable ground, risk of sinkholes. He accepted it without question, marked the site for contractor review. I quit 2 weeks later. Found work doing building inspections in Parkersburg, nothing that required going into remote areas. Haven't been back to that forest. Don't plan to. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that humming, low and constant, coming from somewhere I can't quite place. Story 4. I was a traveling nurse, working contract jobs across the mid-Atlantic, going wherever the pay was good and the need was high. In early spring, I picked up a 3-month contract at a rural hospital near Lewisburg. Small facility, mostly dealing with minor emergencies and routine care. Easy work, good money, scenic area. The hospital put me up in a furnished apartment on the outskirts of town, a single-bedroom unit in a converted farmhouse that had been split into 4 rentals. My place was on the ground floor, with a small patio that looked out over a field, and beyond that, the dense woods of the Greenbrier River Valley. My shifts were long, 12 hours, usually 3 or 4 days a week. My days off, I'd explore the area, hiking the trails around the Greenbrier, visiting the local shops, getting to know the region. It was peaceful, a welcome change from the urban chaos of my previous contracts. About a month in, one of the older nurses, a woman named Constance who'd worked at the hospital for 30 years, pulled me aside during a shift. She asked where I was staying. When I told her, she got this look, hard to describe, somewhere between concern and resignation. She told me to be careful walking near the river, especially at dusk. Said people had been going missing in that area for decades. Not in big numbers, just 1 or 2 every few years. Hikers, mostly, or people camping alone. They'd set out on a trail, never come back. Search parties would find their cars, sometimes their gear, but never the people themselves. I thanked her for the warning, filed it away under local paranoia, and didn't think much more about it. Then I started hearing the calls. It began on a Thursday night, my first night off after a brutal stretch of shifts. I was on my patio, reading, enjoying the cool evening air. The sun had just set, leaving that brief window of deep blue twilight before full darkness. That's when I heard it. A voice, clear and distinct, calling my name. Jennifer. I looked up from my book, scanned the field and tree line. Nothing. No one. Jennifer. Closer this time, coming from the direction of the woods, it sounded like a woman's voice. Familiar somehow, though I couldn't place it. I stood up, walked to the edge of the patio, called out, "Hello, who's there?" Silence. I waited a few more minutes, then went back to my book, convinced I'd imagined it, but the unease lingered, a prickling at the back of my neck that wouldn't go away. The calls continued over the next several nights, always around dusk, always my name, always from the direction of the woods. Sometimes it sounded like my mother, sometimes like my sister, sometimes like friends I hadn't spoken to in years, but never quite right, always slightly off, like someone imitating a voice from memory. I mentioned it to Constance during our next shift together. Her face went pale. She told me not to respond, not to acknowledge the voices, and under no circumstances should I go into the woods to investigate. Said that's how they got you. The voices would call, familiar and comforting, drawing you deeper into the forest until you couldn't find your way back. I asked who they were. She just shook her head, said nobody really knew. But the pattern was always the same. People heard their names called, followed the voices, and vanished. That night, I closed my patio door and drew the curtains, turned on the TV loud enough to drown out any sounds from outside, but I could still hear it. Faint but persistent, seeping through the wall, and "Jennifer, come here, Jennifer." It went on for hours. The next evening, I was ready. I sat on my patio with my phone out, recording. When the calls started, I captured them, clear as day, a woman's voice calling my name over and over. I played it back immediately, wanting proof I wasn't losing my mind. The recording was silent. Nothing but ambient noise, wind, distant traffic. No voices, no calls, just empty audio. I tried again the next night. Same result. The voices were clear to my ears, unmistakable. But the recorder captured nothing. A week later, I saw her. I'd been coming home from a late shift, pulling into the driveway around midnight. As I got out of my car, I noticed someone standing at the edge of the field, right where the grass met the woods. A woman wearing a pale dress, her hair loose around her shoulders. She was looking right at me. I froze, keys in hand, car doors still open. We stared at each other for what felt like minutes, though it was probably only seconds. Then she raised her hand, beckoning. "Jennifer, come here." The voice was hers. I could see her lips moving, but it sounded like it was coming from right next to me, whispered directly into my ear. Every rational part of my brain told me to go inside, lock the door, call someone. But another part, something deeper, almost primal, wanted to walk toward her, wanted to see who she was, wanted to follow. I took a step forward. Then my phone rang, loud and jarring, breaking the spell. I fumbled it out of my pocket, looked at the screen. My sister, calling from Oregon. When I looked back up, the woman was gone. I ran inside, locked every door and window, turned on every light, answered my sister's call with shaking hands. She asked if I was okay, said she'd had a weird feeling and wanted to check in. I told her I was fine, just tired. We talked for a few minutes, normal sister stuff, and by the time we hung up, I felt more grounded. But I couldn't stop thinking about that moment. The pull I'd felt, how close I'd come to walking into those woods. I broke my contract 2 weeks later, cited personal reasons, found a new position in Maryland. The hospital wasn't happy, but they didn't fight it. Constance hugged me when I left, told me I made the right choice, said she'd seen too many people ignore the warnings, convinced they were smarter or stronger or just lucky enough to resist. Most of them didn't come back. I drive through West Virginia sometimes now, on my way to other contracts. But I never stop, never pull over near the woods, never roll down my windows after dark. And if I ever hear my name called from somewhere I can't see, I keep walking. Story 5, I grew up in Beckley, in a neighborhood where half the families had someone who worked the mines. My father was a foreman at a coal operation about 15 miles outside town, had been for 20 years. It was hard work, dangerous work, but it paid for our house, put food on the table, sent me to college. During summer breaks, I'd pick up shifts doing surface work at the mine. Maintenance mostly, and helping with equipment repair, logging materials. Nothing underground. My father was adamant about that. Said the mines took enough from our family, no need for them to take his son too. But the summer I turned 22, they were short-staffed. A crew had quit after some kind of incident. Details were vague, and they needed bodies underground to meet quota. The pay was triple what I made on the surface. My father didn't like it, but he didn't forbid it either. Just told me to stay close to the experienced guys and follow every safety protocol to the letter. My first week underground was uneventful, claustrophobic and dark and loud, but nothing I couldn't handle. The crew I worked with was solid, guys who'd been doing this for decades, knew every tunnel and shaft and support beam. They moved through the darkness with confidence, headlamps cutting through the dust, voices steady and calm. Then we broke through into an old section. It was accidental. We'd been clearing a collapse when one of the walls gave way, revealing a passage that wasn't on any of the maps. Old mining operations from the 20s or 30s, back when safety regulations were more suggestion than law. The foreman radioed the surface, reported the discovery, was told to mark it and move on. But one of the younger guys, Derek, wanted to explore. Said there might be equipment worth salvaging, or at the very least, it'd be interesting. The foreman said no, but Derek slipped away during our lunch break. He came back 20 minutes later, face white, hands shaking. said he'd seen something down there. Someone standing in one of the side tunnels. Just standing, completely still, watching him. The foreman asked if he'd called out. Derek nodded, said the figure didn't respond and didn't move, just stared. Then, slowly, it had started walking toward him. Derek ran. The foreman radioed the surface again, reported a possible trespasser in the old section. Security was dispatched. A team swept the tunnels, found nothing, no signs of entry, no footprints, no evidence anyone had been down there in decades. Derek was told to shake it off, probably just shadows and nerves. But he didn't come back the next day or the day after that. Eventually put in his notice, said he was done with mining. The rest of us tried to laugh it off. But the mood in the crew changed. People were quieter, more jumpy, headlamps sweeping the darkness more frequently. A few days later, I saw it too. We were working a new face, extending a tunnel into a seam. When I turned to grab a tool and caught movement in my peripheral vision, I swung my headlamp toward it, the beam catching a figure standing about 30 feet back, just beyond the lights of our work area. It was a man, or had been, wearing old mining gear, clothes that looked like they were from a different era. His face was covered in coal dust, so thick I couldn't make out his features. He was just standing there, arms at his sides, head tilted slightly, watching us. I called out to the crew, pointed. Everyone turned, their lights converging on the spot. The figure was gone. I insisted I'd seen someone, described what I'd seen, but the foreman just sighed and told me to get back to work. Said the old sections played tricks on people, shadows and dust, and the mind filling in blanks. But I knew what I'd seen. Over the next week, more people reported sightings. Always the same figure, always in the old sections, always watching. Tools started going missing. Equipment would be moved overnight, and sometimes, in the quiet moments between shifts, we'd hear footsteps echoing through the tunnels. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, coming from passages that were supposed to be sealed. The foreman finally reported it up the chain, requested permission to seal off the old section completely. Permission was granted, and a crew spent 3 days pouring concrete, blocking every entrance. It didn't help. The sightings continued, now in areas that had no connection to the old sections. The figure appeared deeper in the mine, sometimes right behind crew members, standing so close they could feel a presence. But when they turned, nothing. I saw him one last time. I was alone, checking a ventilation shaft, when my headlamp flickered and died. I cursed, fumbled for my backup light, clicked it on. He was standing right in front of me, close enough to touch, his face inches from mine. Coal dust so thick it looked like tar. His eyes, I could see his eyes now, pale and empty, staring through me rather than at me. His mouth opened, revealing broken teeth, and he spoke. One word. Leave. The voice was wrong, layered, like multiple people speaking at once. It echoed in the confined space, bouncing off the walls and growing louder. Leave, leave, leave. I ran. Dropped my tools, left everything. Just ran through the tunnels toward the elevator. Hit the call button. Waited an eternity. The whole time expecting to feel hands on my shoulders. To hear that voice again. When I reached the surface, I told my father I was done. He didn't argue, just nodded, like he'd been expecting it. The mine closed 6 months later. Officially, they cited declining coal prices and increased safety costs. Unofficially, they couldn't keep crews. People were quitting faster than they could hire replacements. All with the same vague reasons. Didn't feel safe, bad atmosphere. Time to move on. The entrance was sealed. The property sold to a development company with plans for something else. But as far as I know, nothing's been built there. The land just sits empty and forgotten. Sometimes, when I drive past it, I can still feel it. That presence from the tunnels, watching. Before we continue, if these stories are giving you chills, please hit that like button. It really does help this channel reach more people. And if you have your own encounters from West Virginia or anywhere in Appalachia, share them in the comments. Some of the best stories come from viewers like you. Your engagement makes a real difference in pushing this content to others who need to hear these warnings. Thank you for being part of this community. Story 6. I managed a bed and breakfast in Berkeley Springs for almost 3 years. A Victorian-era house that had been converted into guest rooms, each one decorated with period furniture and antique fixtures. The place was beautiful, popular with tourists looking for a romantic getaway or history enthusiasts wanting to experience old-world charm. The owners were a retired couple from Alexandria who bought the property as an investment, but they spent most of their time traveling, leaving day-to-day operations to me. I lived in a small apartment on the 3rd floor, handled bookings, managed staff, ensured guests had everything they needed. It was good work, steady, and I enjoyed the responsibility. The house had 7 guest rooms, but one, the Rose Room on the 2nd floor, had a reputation. Guests who stayed there often reported strange occurrences, items moving on their own, cold spots, the feeling of being watched. Some would request to change rooms in the middle of the night. Others would leave reviews mentioning an unsettling atmosphere. I'd stayed in the Rose Room myself a few times during maintenance checks or when we were fully booked and I needed to troubleshoot something. Never experienced anything unusual, just an ordinary bedroom with a nice view of the garden. But the stories persisted. One couple, celebrating their anniversary, checked out after a single night. The husband was furious, demanded a full refund, said his wife had been terrified by something in the room. When I asked what, he said she'd woken up to find a woman standing at the foot of their bed, watching them sleep, tall, wearing a long dark dress, with hair that hung past her shoulders. The wife refused to discuss it, just sat in the lobby with her bags, arms crossed, staring at the floor. I refunded them, apologized profusely, and made a note to have someone check the room's locks and windows. Everything was secure, no signs of forced entry, no evidence anyone had been in there. A few weeks later, it happened again. Different guests, same story. A woman in a dark dress, standing by the window, perfectly still, watching. I started asking questions, digging into the house's history. The owners didn't know much, just that it had been built in 1887 by a wealthy merchant named Elias Whitmore. He'd lived there with his wife and daughter until his death in 1903. After that, the property changed hands several times, eventually becoming a boarding house before its conversion to a B&B. I found an old photograph in the attic, a family portrait from the 1890s. Elias stood in the center, stern and formal, his wife beside him, and between them, a young woman who must have been their daughter. She was tall, slender, with dark hair and an expression that seemed almost defiant. The photo had been taken in front of the house, and I recognized the window behind them, the Rose Room. I showed the photo to one of the guests who'd reported seeing the woman. Her face went pale. She pointed at the daughter and said, "That's her. That's who I saw." From that point on, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me in that house. I'd be walking down the hallway, catch movement in my peripheral vision, turn to find nothing. Doors I knew I'd closed would be open. The temperature in the Rose Room would drop suddenly, even in summer, leaving a chill that lingered for hours. One night, and after all the guests had checked in and settled, I was doing my final walkthrough of the property. As I passed the Rose Room, I noticed the door was ajar. Strange, because the room was unoccupied that night. I pushed it open, reached for the light switch. The room was freezing. My breath misted in front of me, and I could see frost forming on the inside of the window. In July, I stood in the doorway, hand still on the light switch, when I heard it, breathing, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere inside the room. I couldn't see anyone, but the sound was unmistakable, rhythmic and close. Then the window, which had been closed and latched, swung open. No wind, no movement. It just opened on its own, the hinges creaking softly. I backed out of the room, closed the door, locked it from the outside. Stood in the hallway for a moment, heart pounding, trying to decide what to do. The breathing continued, muffled now by the door, but still audible. I didn't go back in. The next morning, when I unlocked the room, everything was normal. Window closed, temperature comfortable, no signs of anything unusual. But on the inside of the glass, written in what looked like condensation, were 3 words. "Get them out." The letters were uneven, childlike, as if drawn with a finger. By the time I grabbed my phone to take a picture, they'd already begun to fade. I reported it to the owners, told them we needed to address whatever was happening in that room. They were skeptical, suggested maybe we'd been encouraging the ghost stories, that guests were experiencing placebo effects. But I knew better. We stopped booking the Rose Room, told guests it was under renovation. The activity didn't stop, but it became less frequent. Occasional cold spots, shadows that didn't quite belong, but nothing as dramatic as before. I left the B&B a year later, took a job managing a hotel in Charleston. The owners eventually sold the property, and it's been through several hands since. Last I heard, it was closed, sitting empty, while the current owners decide what to do with it. I drove past it once, a few years ago, on my way through Berkeley Springs. The house looked tired, paint peeling, garden overgrown, but the Rose Room window, even from the street, even in broad daylight, looked dark. And I swear, just for a moment, I saw someone standing there, watching. Story 7. I drove a long-haul truck for a logistics company based out of Huntington, running routes through West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. It was solitary work, which I preferred. Just me and the road and whatever podcast or audiobook I'd queued up. I'd been doing it for 7 years, seen every mile of highway in the state, knew which rest stops had decent coffee and which truck stops to avoid. The road I'm about to describe was one I'd driven hundreds of times, a stretch of Route 60 that runs east from Charleston, through Fayette County, into the mountains. Familiar, predictable, boring even. Until it wasn't. It was late October, around 11 p.m., and I was heading back to Huntington after dropping a load in Beckley. The weather had turned, rain coming down steady, the kind that makes the road shine under your headlights and cuts visibility to nothing. I was about 15 miles outside Raynell when I saw her. A woman, standing on the shoulder, thumb out, soaked to the bone. She wasn't dressed for the weather, just jeans and a light jacket, no umbrella, no bag, just standing there in the rain like she'd been waiting for hours on. I slowed down, pulled onto the shoulder ahead of her, and waited. She ran up to the passenger side, and I leaned over to open the door. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair plastered to her face. She climbed in without a word, dripping water all over the seat. I asked where she was heading. She said Ansted, about 20 miles up the road. I told her I could drop her there. No problem. She nodded, didn't say anything else, just sat there shivering. I cranked up the heat, offered her a towel from my sleeper cab. She took it, wiped her face, but didn't dry her hair, just sat there, staring straight ahead, hands folded in her lap. I tried making conversation, asked what she was doing out in the rain, if her car had broken down. She didn't answer, just kept staring. After a few minutes, I gave up, focused on the road. The rain was getting worse, visibility dropping, and I needed to pay attention. That's when I noticed the smell. Not rain or wet clothes, but something else. Something organic and wrong. Like standing water. Stagnant and thick, it filled the cab, made my stomach turn. I glanced at her. She hadn't moved, still staring straight ahead, but water was pooling under her seat now. More than should have been possible from just wet clothes. It was spreading, seeping toward my side of the cab. I asked if she was okay. No response. The smell got worse, thick enough to taste, and I noticed her hands. They were pale, too pale, almost blue, and the skin looked waterlogged, wrinkled like she'd been submerged for hours. I pulled the truck over, hard, gravel crunching under the tires, turned to face her, about to demand answers. She was looking at me now. Her eyes, God, her eyes were wrong. milky, unfocused, staring but not seeing. And her mouth, when she opened it, water poured out. Not a trickle, a stream, spilling down her chin, onto her lap, soaking the seat. I scrambled for the door, threw it open, jumped out into the rain. By the time I circled around to the passenger side, she was gone. The door was still closed, the cab empty, but the seat was soaked. Puddles of water on the floor, and that smell, that awful smell, still hung in the air. I stood there in the rain, shaking, trying to process what I'd just seen. Pulled out my phone, checked the time. 11:47 p.m. I got back in the truck, didn't close the door, just sat there breathing hard. Eventually, I radioed dispatch, said I was pulling over for the night, needed to rest. They didn't question it. I spent the next 2 hours at a rest stop, doors locked, lights on, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. But the seat was still wet. The smell was still there. The next day, I asked around at truck stops, other drivers who ran that road. Most hadn't heard anything. But one older guy, a driver who'd been running these roads for 30 years, knew exactly what I was talking about. He said her name was Eliza Marsh, or at least that's who people thought she was. Back in the 70s, her car went off the road during a storm, ended up in the Gauley River. They found the car 3 days later, but never recovered her body. She's been hitching that stretch of road ever since, he said, always during rainstorms, always heading to Ansted. Most drivers who pick her up don't see her get out. She just vanishes somewhere along the route. He told me I was lucky, that some drivers reported accidents after picking her up. Vehicles losing control, running off the road, sometimes in the exact same spot where she'd gone into the river. I stopped driving that route after that, requested different assignments, took longer routes to avoid Route 60 altogether. The company didn't care, as long as deliveries were on time. I still drive trucks, but I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore. Don't care if it's raining, don't care if they look desperate. Some people aren't looking for a ride, they're looking for company. Story 8, I worked for the state park system, doing trail maintenance and cave assessments, mostly in the southern part of West Virginia. It was good work, outdoors, physical, and I got to see parts of the state most people never would. Hidden valleys, old-growth forests, caves that had been forming for millions of years. One of my assignments was to evaluate a cave system near Lewisburg, recently discovered by local cavers, to determine if it could be developed into a public attraction. The initial survey team had mapped about a mile of passages, found some interesting formations, stalactites and flowstone, but noted some unusual acoustic properties. I arrived at the site on a clear morning in late September, met with the local caving club that had discovered it, and geared up for the descent. Standard equipment, helmet, headlamp, rope, radio. One of the cavers, a guy named Tom who'd been exploring these hills for 20 years, volunteered to guide me. The entrance was a narrow crack in a hillside, barely wide enough to squeeze through, opening into a larger chamber about 15 feet down. We rappelled in, landed on smooth limestone, and began our survey. The cave was beautiful. Pristine formations everywhere, mineral deposits creating intricate patterns on the walls. The air was cool and damp, and our voices echoed strangely, bouncing off the irregular surfaces in unexpected ways. About half a mile in, we reached a junction, 3 passages branching off in different directions. Tom pointed to the one on the left, said it led to a larger chamber with some spectacular columns. We headed that way. The passage narrowed, forcing us to duck, then opened into a cavern easily the size of a school gymnasium. Our headlamps couldn't reach the ceiling, just disappeared into darkness above us. That's when we heard it. A scream, high-pitched, anguished, echoing through the cavern. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, then cut off abruptly. Tom and I froze, looking at each other, waiting. Another scream, closer this time, coming from one of the side passages. Tom keyed his radio, called to the surface team, asked if anyone else was in the cave. They confirmed it was just us. No other cavers scheduled for today. We waited, listening. The screaming continued, irregular intervals, sometimes close, sometimes distant. Always that same anguished tone. Tom wanted to leave, said we'd done enough surveying for one day. I agreed. We backtracked through the passages, moving quickly, headlamps sweeping the darkness. The screaming followed us, always just behind, just out of sight. When we finally reached the entrance chamber, the surface team pulled us up, asked what happened. We described the screaming. They looked confused, said they hadn't heard anything from above. We reviewed the radio recordings, listened to the transmissions from inside the cave. Our voices came through clearly, but the screaming, nothing. Just our voices and static. Tom refused to go back in. Said the cave had a bad feeling that we should seal it and forget about it. I filed my report, noted the acoustic anomalies, recommended against development. The state park system agreed, citing safety concerns, and the cave was left alone. But I couldn't stop thinking about those screams. 3 months later, I went back, alone. Told myself I needed better documentation, wanted to understand what we'd heard. But really, I needed to know. I descended into the cave, made my way back to that large cavern, set up recording equipment, waited. The screaming started almost immediately. But this time, I could hear words. Not English, something older, guttural. And underneath the screaming, other sounds, shuffling, scraping, like something moving through the passages. I grabbed my gear, started backing toward the exit. That's when I saw them. Shapes, moving in the darkness beyond my headlamp's reach. Tall, thin, moving with an unnatural gait. There were at least a dozen, maybe more, all converging on my position. I ran. Didn't look back, didn't stop, just ran through the passages, trusting muscle memory to guide me. Behind me, the screaming intensified, joined by other voices, creating a cacophony that filled every corner of the cave. I hit the entrance chamber, clipped onto the rope, and climbed, hands shaking so badly I nearly slipped twice. When I finally pulled myself out into daylight, I collapsed on the ground, gasping. I never went back, never filed a supplemental report. The cave remains sealed, forgotten by most. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those screams. And I wonder what else is down there, in the dark, waiting. Thank you for watching Park Ranger Files. If these stories affected you, if they made you think twice about those dark corners of West Virginia, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Every week, we bring you real encounters from people who've experienced the unexplainable. Your likes and comments help this channel grow and reach others who need these warnings. Share your own stories in the comments below. You never know who might need to hear them. Remember, the algorithm rewards engagement. So every interaction you make helps push this content to people who need it. Stay safe out there. And remember, some things in these mountains are older than we can imagine. Until next time.